Welcome to another episode of Decomposing Messiaen, where we are reading through each of the chapters in Messiaen's compositional textbook, The Techniques of My Musical Language. Today is chapter 9, which is Birdsong. Before we get started, let me just plug my website, zenglop.net. And in particular, on that website, there's a link for a newsletter that I'm starting to put out. And if you click on that link, you'll be able to submit your email. And then periodically, you'll get notifications of new work or other updates. Maybe once a month, once or twice a month, maybe. So check that out. I'll also put that in the show notes. So, Chapter 9, Birdsong. The previous episode, we started to talk about melodic structure in Messiaen. And before that, all of the chapters had been relating to melodic mechanisms, the devices, the practices, the techniques that Messiaen uses to generate rhythmic overlay, rhythmic patterns. We talked a lot about the importance of this unfolding of a rhythmic matrix within Messiaen, on top of which the melodic and harmonic material kind of rotates within its own plane. So the last chapter, chapter 8, talked about some of the structure of melody, how melody follows a form of arrival, emphasis, and departure. So it's interesting then that we are introduced to those concepts, and then we have a chapter on birdsong. It is particularly interesting that the chapter on birdsong is probably the shortest chapter in this book. It is one page here. It's short enough that I can read the entire chapter to you, which I will do. There are some musical examples that Messiaen provides, as with all other chapters, but only a handful, given the shortness of the chapter. I do have notes that I've taken from reading a separate book, where Messiaen later in his career provided more details on the use of birdsong. It's important to think of this as the first articulation of Messiaen's ideas, right? The Techniques was written in the mid-40s. The music that he was writing at that time was music like the Quartet for the End of Time. And while there are definitely bird song elements in that piece, there is nothing like what you find later on, where pieces like the esquisse sketches, birdsong sketches, the Réveil des Oiseaux, the Catalogue des Oiseaux, pieces for solo piano that deliberately articulate a wide range of individual birds in consort. But the idea that you could identify the song that's used in the piece becomes much more important later in his career. Not that the song is unidentifiable in the quartet. He uses the blackbird song. But he doesn't call it out. He doesn't notate it as such. In pieces like Réveil des Oiseaux, he even suggests that the performer become familiar with the location that the birds might live in. And certainly we will be expected to know the birdsong as the performer and bring that understanding to the performance. It's very different. The material becomes much more concrete in its definition of the birdsong. So let me start, right? Here's chapter 9. Paul Dukas, who was Messiaen's professor at the Conservatoire, Paul Dukas used to say, "Listen to the birds. They are great masters." I confess not having awaited this advice to admire analyze and notate some songs of birds. Through the mixture of their songs, birds make extremely refined jumbles of rhythmic petals. Their melodic contours, those of merles especially, surpass the human imagination in fantasy. Since they are untempered intervals smaller than the semitone, and as it is ridiculous servilely to copy nature, we are going to give some examples of melodies of the, quote, bird genre, which will be transcription, transformation, and interpretation of the volleys and trills of our little servants of immaterial joy. It is a wonderful description, servants of immaterial joy. And I wonder if Messiaen didn't also consider himself a little servant of immaterial joy. I may start to use that as a mantra, perhaps. It has that fleeting quality, right? That ephemeral nature that really resides in the nature of phenomena. It is immaterial, which does not mean that it is insignificant. It means that it has no permanence to it. It is an occurrence. This is especially true with music and with sound that exists on top of time. It's one thing to look at a table and to observe it as an apparently permanent phenomena, but understanding that this too is impermanent because it is collated of time and materials and work to bring it to this form. It is another to look at my own form and think, well, this is impermanent. This body is impermanent as it is born and ages, and then ultimately will pass on and die. It is yet another thing to think of what I think of as myself as being permanent, and it is an illusion and a delusion to think that. And perhaps if I think of that word, if my sense of self is but a little servant of immaterial joy, it allows me to participate in this moment, but then to flutter away. The volleys and trills, the transcription, transformation, and an interpretation of the volleys. I think later in Messiaen's compositional career, the transcription becomes more notable, right? The effort taken to recreate a particular birdsong, identifiably so, I think becomes more important later in his career than it is now. But he is always transforming and interpreting the sound. As we go through some of these examples, when he says that birds make extremely refined jumbles of rhythmic petals, I think it's fascinating and wonderful that as a composer, he has an interest in rhythmic petals and in melodic fantasy that bedazzles. He uses the word bedazzle, and harmony that fits in a sort of scrupulous overlay. And that in birdsong he finds material that is external to his own intuition, but yet aligns with it. When he is notating birdsong, he's not sampling birdsong. Messiaen could not have done what he wanted to do with electronics, with a sample of birdsongs, overlaid them all. That would not have been sufficient. It would not have transformed the sound into the structure that he was looking for. He wanted it to be brought into a human realm, and he wanted to emphasize that overlay, that structure. It's not a coincidence that he spent the first third of the book talking about rhythmic pedals and rhythmic ostinati and rhythmic patterns, and then in his distilled definition of why birdsong is admirable and why he analyzes and notates it, he talks about what occurs when more than one bird sings at the same time. You have these two distinct individual gestures that overlay and then repeat in varying patterns. And so you get from two related but different voices singing in parallel, they shift through their performance of it. And then that is simply magnified when there's more than two, when there's three of them, four of them, or a flock of them. So his admiration when he says to admire, analyze, and notate. There's some wonderful pictures of Messiaen in the parks, in the gardens, in the woods, listening and notating. I'll try and dig up some pictures to put it in here, but you can see him out looking, and here's what the notes look like. A very rapid capturing of the gesture. When he used the bird song in his music, he spent a lot of time on the harmonies of the birds. The melody and the contour of the melody was one part, but the bird harmony sort of modulates itself because it's trilling so quickly. There's an implied modulatory harmony that he tries to recreate in the orchestration instrumentation of the pieces. And you see that getting worked out in his notebooks. These notebooks that have birdsong in them also captured his description of natural sounds like waterfalls or wind in the mountains. And you can see him thinking of these objects, these sonic objects, as sort of not found material, but source material that then can be a prompt for his imagination and his curiosity. So to talk more about the notation, I've pulled out this book, which is Paul Griffith's Olivier Messiaen and the Music of Time. I think I mentioned this in other episodes. He has a chapter on birdsong, and he talks about some of the same ideas. You can see how Griffith is pulling out the ideas of transformation and the role that the music of the birds plays in the original sourcing of the piece. But I wanted to read this section where he talks specifically about Messiaen's notation. Ultimately, all that can be said about Messiaen's notation is that it is painstaking. He says all that it is, because he's been talking about, is it ornithological? Is he trying to notate for scientific study? And he clearly isn't. He wants to be accurate, and he wants the bird to be identifiable, particularly by the time of the pieces that Griffith is talking about. But it is not. It is not a scientific notation. It is, after all, ultimately to be used as the source material for music. He has detailed how he goes out into the country armed with binoculars, an identification manual, music paper, and pencils, taking down the songs as if they were exercises in dictation or folk music to be collected. Only in later years has he sought the assistance of a tape recorder. The idea of collecting birdsong in the manner of folk song collectors like Bartok, for example, who would then use the folk song in kind of the same way that Messiaen uses birdsong, right? It's rarely a direct quotation of the song. It's always parsed through at least a harmonic alteration or enrichment of some kind, and quite often rhythmic and melodic changes as well. I'm very fond of the British folk song collectors, Cecil Sharp, George Butterworth, Ralph Vaughan Williams. The idea of sort of tootling around the countryside with a pipe and a tweed jacket and a notebook, and capturing sort of Morris dance songs working hard, and then afternoon pulling into a country pub and drawing a pint of beer, lighting my pipe, looking back over my notes. I find that a particularly inspirational romanticization of the task. So Messiaen then, only in later years has he sought the assistance of a tape recorder. It's notable that many of the bird songs that he uses are not birds that he actually heard in his own physical hearing. I was going to say in real life, but that's a stupid thing to say, because listening to a gramophone record is real life. But he didn't necessarily experience in the flesh the actual birds. He had gramophone collections that he would listen to, which isn't to say that when he traveled in America or in Japan or certainly throughout France, he was exposed to many different birds. But there's some African birds and some Asian birds that he would have heard only on a recording. The problem of accurate transcription thus enters his work at once, and he means at once, in the actual act of capturing it when you're out in the field. And he evidently has no illusions about the insufficiency of human musical means to record birdsong. Okay, so that's Griffiths introducing now the quote that I want to read from Messiaen. Again, this is a quote from an interview he gave maybe 20 years after he wrote Techniques of My Musical Language, so significantly later on than the chapter that we're actually looking at. But you can see how the same ideas are in play. So this is now Messiaen. Birds sing in exceedingly fast tempos, which are absolutely impossible for our instruments. And so I have to transcribe the song in a slower tempo. Moreover, this speed is bound up with an extreme sharpness, birds being able to sing in exceedingly high registers that are inaccessible to our instruments. And so I notate them 1, 2, 3, or 4 octaves lower. Right, so speed, transposition. And that is not all. For the same reason I have to suppress very small intervals that our instruments cannot execute. I replace these intervals of the order of a comma or two by semitones. But I keep the same scale of values between different intervals, which is to say that if a few commas correspond to a semitone, a true semitone will correspond to a whole tone or a third. Everything is enlarged, but the relationships stay the same, so that my version is still exact. It is a transposition of what I've heard onto a more human scale. So again, Messiaen isn't sampling the birds, and he isn't looking for a precision. He's looking for meaningfulness. I was going to say exactitude instead of precision, but that's a distinction that maybe is a bit waffly. He's looking to be able to maintain the meaningfulness of the songs within the music that he's writing. So Griffiths continues, and he talks about then how can we think about the bird song in Messiaen's music, or how do we think Messiaen might have thought about it? And it's symbolic, right? Like the birds represent more than just the fact that they were birds. He's not creating a soundtrack. He's creating a sort of a mythical tableau, and the bird song is part of what creates that. You know, I said earlier that it's fortuitous that bird song happens to demonstrate the criteria or the attributes that Messiaen found interesting as a composer. Or maybe it's the other way around, and the bird song, he's interested in the bird song because of his compositional interests. Did the bird song inspire certain types of composition? Did Messiaen choose to write certain types of tritone-based harmonies and melodies because he was drawn to the birds? Or was he drawn to the birds because he had a hearing within him of a particular type of music? But either way, the birds are sort of this spiritual messenger in the music as these symbols and these objects. And it's very similar to how Messiaen uses plain chant, isn't it? Really, like in much of his music, he is also quoting the liturgy, the chants of the Catholic liturgy. Again, sometimes those are more direct quotes, but quite often they are rhythmically altered through the different techniques that we've talked about of rhythmic embellishment, augmentation, diminution. They are used as patterns for pedals and for ostinati. They are melodically altered in some cases, either with the intervals themselves changing or with notes being placed in. But the chant itself is a source in the same way that the birdsong is a source that meets certain compositional criteria. They do certain things. They shape things in a certain way that fit with what Messiaen wants to do. But it also fits with how he, I think, thinks of symbols, and that his music is laden with symbols that are there to direct and guide us, the audience, to a particular type of experience. Is it important that we know which chant it is? Is it important that we know which bird song it is? Messiaen thinks it is, because he notates what the chant is, or he notates what the bird is. I mentioned earlier that if you're performing these birdsong pieces, in the introductions, Messiaen is very clear. He wants you to really know the birdsong. He wants you to bring that understanding, that feeling, that meaningfulness to the performance. I don't know what the chants are, and I don't really know what the birdsongs are. And I still love the music because it is a kind of gesture that I like as a listener, as a composer. I like that kind of trilly, velocity-laden, augmented, rhythmic patterning. If I sit down and improvise at the piano, that's often what it will sound like. There, as an example, I'm just going to reach over. So the idea that the birds are like neumes, they are like the symbolic representation of musical gesture, and that this is how Messiaen is putting together the spiritual message that he wants from the music. So I'm going to play some of the examples that are in the chapter, but I'm going to do that last, because once I turn the camera around, there's no way I'll get it back, and I'm not very good at plugging all the things in. So this will end with me playing at the keyboard some of the examples. There's a couple other things I wanted to bring in then from my own experience and my own writing. The first is that Messiaen loves the chaffinch in particular. And I do too. In fact, we have a couple of little finches in our living room, and they are always chirping away. Particularly when I'm playing piano, they have definite opinions about music. This will not surprise anybody, but it is absolutely true that if I sit and play Schoenberg, the birds are silent. But if I play, actually just about anything else, they're chirping away, and you can't hardly hear anything else. I played some of the Stockhausen, Klavierstück 9, and they're chirping away happily. The other thing I wanted to talk about then is this idea of this symbolic content. And in my own practice, that turns towards the very low frequency electromagnetic hum. very low frequency electromagnetics is down around the 50 hertz, 50 to 60 hertz, very, very low. And in the wild, so to speak, like away from the electromagnetic activity of the city, what you will hear is this sort of chirping bird-like sound that's caused by lightning strikes. And then through the lower atmosphere of the Earth, the electric residue of that goes for hundreds of kilometers. And because the atmosphere is different densities, it travels at different speeds, and so you end up with the sound of it being distorted and broken up. And if you're in the middle of the desert or far away from the human grid, you can hear this chorus called spherics. You can record these with a relatively simple device and then transduce it into sound. So remember when Messiaen was talking about the challenge of transcribing birdsong, which is very high and very fast and not scaled the same way that our human instruments are. So you make certain adjustments to it. Well, there are certain adjustments that are made in order to be able to hear electromagnetic frequencies, the first of which is that you transduce it from electromagnetism into sound. So, for example, when NASA publishes recordings and say, here's the sound of Jupiter. Well, it's not sound, because sound is a mechanical motion through air that is then perceived by our ears. The sound is also a mechanical motion through water or through any other medium, but we typically think of it as air. The sound of Jupiter is the electromagnetism of Jupiter that is then transposed, and then recreated through digital or other means to make a sound that we can then hear. Same with the very low frequency. And for years I was frustrated that I couldn't hear the spherics. I wanted to record spherics and use them in my music, inspired by them. Beautiful and poetic. But all I could hear was the bloody hum of the urban electric grid, because it's right at the same frequency. Then at a certain point, I realized, some of the sound, this electric hum, is rich in a drone, harmonic way. It's actually really quite beautiful and symbolic and meaningful. And so I started doing field recordings where I would go to specific locations and record the very low frequencies. I have it in mind to do like a full reading of the streets of Pittsburgh, some of the main roads, maybe 4 or 5 miles at a time, walking and recording, and then stopping and exploring specific areas. Would I then use that and try to translate it and interpret it into a piano piece? Maybe. I haven't yet. I wonder what it would sound like. It might sound like Chelsea or something like that, or Tristan Murray, some of the spectral stuff maybe. But certainly in the electronic music that I write, I am very much inspired by the sounds I hear when I go out doing very low frequency recording. And it's the same question I asked about Messiaen. Do I like the very low frequency recording sounds because they remind me of things I like to create anyway, and then there they are? Or is it the other way around? Am I so interested in the poetics of very low frequency, that the sounds that they produce, do I want to recreate those sounds? Either way, I have a notebook that I keep with information about the recordings, and I do try to draw gestural shapes that represent them. Let's see if I can find one. For example, here is a piece that I tried to visually represent what I had heard in a VLF recording and then recreate it. This piece is apocryphal aardvark. I'll put a link to it.
This is a very low frequency receiver. It is tuned to about 60 hertz, which is very low, and it is intended to be used to receive spherics. Spherics are electromagnetic disturbances in the Earth's atmosphere caused by lightning strikes, often hundreds of miles away. So the lightning strikes, and then the electromagnetic resonance spreads out across the through the atmosphere, and it can be picked up on things like this. Spherics are delicate sounding, chirpy sounds. 60 hertz is right around the same frequency as the electromagnetic hum of an urban city grid. So living here where I do, I do not, when I turn this on, I do not pick up delicate etheric spherics. I instead pick up a wall of electromagnetic hum and buzz that is quite penetrating. So off behind me is Penn Avenue going down towards the East Liberty neighborhood of Pittsburgh. And then off in the far distance are the Penn Hills, kind of the geologic formation that marks one of the periphery of what's called the East Liberty Plateau there, where the rivers used to run very broad and slow a long time ago. But this is one of the original levels of that much broader river. So we have the Allegheny over that way, the Monongahela over that way. I'm going to walk down and record a little bit, and then we'll stop in at the intersection down there at Penn and Negley and do another recording.
Took a couple of times to get done. One of the points that I made earlier was that Messiaen thought deeply about the harmonic implications, either of the transposition of the transcription of the birds or of the melody. So the next example is actually and you can see how those are the same notes as the end of the clarinet part. Right? So his transcription of the birdsong and his translation of the birdsong turns into this beautiful harmony. I mean,